Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about hip-hop feminism and music education. Specifically the question, how can intersectional music education learn from aspects of hip-hop feminism? And the large part of the talk today is from the forthcoming chapter, Hip-hop Feminism and Music Education in Hip-Hop and Music Education. I am Shanti, Suki, Osman. A little bit about me to start. I am a musician, a singer, a songwriter. I am also a workshop leader in all of the above. I am a researcher and music educator, and I'm doing a PhD in sexism and racism in German music conservatories, and that is interview-based. So my areas of interest, or the topics in which I work, are everything to do with diversity, anti-discrimination, and feminism and intersectionality, and these approaches in music education. Briefly then on intersectionality. Intersectionality, the concept of intersectionality stems from Black feminist theory, and it's about recognizing the reality of multiple and simultaneously existing and interacting forms of discrimination and privilege. And this term was coined or made more known by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it comes from law. And there's been not such a recent surge, but a growing use of this term in all aspects of education, I think, and especially music education here in Germany, where I am based. And it's all about looking at how we can provide opportunities for learners who are differently discriminated against or differently privileged to learn. Hip-hop feminism, I was really fascinated by this when I first started learning about it. It is a feminism that seeks to create a more nuanced and practice-based approach to dealing with intersectional marginalised perspectives and knowledge production. It seeks to acknowledge, accept, and hold the so-called grey areas. This is a term coined by Joan Morgan, who's often considered the sort of mother of hip-hop feminism. This idea of the grey areas between empowerment, self-expression, the amplification of marginalised voices, but then the often misogynistic, homophobic and violent content as expressed through the lyrics and video images and content of hip-hop culture and music. So it's sort of a feminism that's designed to deal with all of these issues without being judgmental, which we'll hear about later on, this idea of, feminists and Black feminists who love hip-hop. They love listening to hip-hop even though they believe that hip-hop doesn't really love them. So what I've done with this chapter is I've taken 4 aspects of hip-hop feminism that I think are really interesting. So these are sort of 4 developments of the theory, if you like, and I've looked at these 4 aspects, and it was difficult to choose because there are so many. And I've considered how they could be useful for music education contexts, particularly looking at this idea of intersectionality, and with that also anti-discrimination. So the first one is the notion of threading and stitching, which comes from Catherine Knight Steele's theories of digital Black feminisms. And this looks at the technology and tools that we use in hip-hop. There is the notion of bringing the wreck by Gwendolyn Pough, and this concerns itself with image and representation in hip-hop. There is Kinetic Orality by Gaunt, and this is to do with the storytelling aspect in hip-hop and who gets to tell stories and things like that. And then there's the quite controversially named Melodic Misogyny, which is coined by Trevor B. Lindsey, and that's to do with sound and listening in hip-hop. And I owe a great deal of my knowledge on hip-hop feminism to Lindsey's work in particular. So if they ever listen to this, I hope they can give me some pointers on it. So we're going to start with Digital Black Feminism's Threading and Stitching. The concept of threading and stitching belongs to a range of components of digital Black feminism as expounded by Catherine Knight Steele. Digital Black feminism aims to redefine technology from the perspective of Black women, including defining technology as not only referring to handheld practical tools, but to tools of social practice too. The process of tracing the relationship between Black women and technology includes navigating racial and gendered stereotypes, historical erasure, storytelling power, and epistemic injustice. Beginning from what she refers to with a humanizing intention as the time when people were enslavers and people were enslaved, Knight Steele details the historic relationship that Black women have had and have not been allowed to have with technology. The colonial notion of both being a woman and being a labourer excluded Black women. Women were seen as white and labourers were seen as Black men, and Black women fit into neither of these categories. However, it was within the realms of household labour and physical labour that they developed their technologies. And since these realms of household and physical labour were not places where Black women's presence or power were acknowledged, then neither were there technological tools, tricks or methods and means that they developed within them. So it's sort of like double erasure, if you like, their very presence and also the knowledge that they produced. And Catherine Knight Steele also states that with the advent of the image of the technical expert being white and male, Black women's technological practices and any records of them also disappeared from history. So the concept of threading and stitching allows for a rethinking of the definition of technology to include further tricks and tools of social practice, which can contribute to a critical employment of hip-hop in music education contexts. Here, Knight Steele directly explains this as the quality of interweaving artistic persona and or working persona with personal persona. So that's what's being threaded and stitched here. So with this interweaving, with this threading and stitching, there also comes an interweaving of biography, positionality, action, and everyday experience with working persona, performed persona, artistic persona. So you could also think of that a little bit as sort of personal and private sort of feelings and thoughts and character with that which you choose to sort of project to the world. In her explication of intersectional hip-hop feminism, one of Rehan Shaheen's most pointed digs at German gangster rap, for example, but I'm sure she doesn't limit it just to that, is that misogyny is often argued away as being part of the artist persona and not representative of the actual opinions of the rappers. Indeed, there is the argument that rappers and hip-hop artists subjected to an intersection of marginalisation use this artist persona as a way to vent frustration and to stage successful and empowered identities which may not reflect their actual lived experience, namely when they are not seen as a rap artist. Here, the principle is a separation of self and the artist persona, but Knight Steele's discernment of the digital Black feminist technology of threading and stitching suggests exactly that, a sewing together, intertwining, interweaving of actual lived experience with artistic expression. So I suggest that a more concrete use of this approach can, on the one hand, further validate the situated knowledge and lived experience of marginalised groups, and on the other hand, it can also allow users of misogynistic language and tropes to not just reproduce them in an uncritical, unreflected way, but to add their own voice and views in critiquing and countering them in hip-hop practice. Both of these notions allow for more nuanced experiences of hip-hop in music educational settings. So the next idea is bringing the wreck. Gwendolyn Poe's theory of bringing the wreck addresses the public gaze on Black women and considers how Black women in hip-hop employ techniques of causing a stir and creating a spectacle in order to redefine how they are represented within the field and, of course, beyond. The action of Black women somehow inserting themselves and demanding visibility is characteristic of many offshoots and developments of hip-hop feminism. For example, Steele, who we've just heard about, identifies aspects of digital Black feminist practice that involve the curated self. This performance of self is simultaneously very real in the sense that it is intended and chosen representation of themselves in a space that would rather render them invisible. Joan Morgan, too, who I mentioned at the very beginning, wrote in this retrospectively added afterword to her original book, When the Chicken Heads Come to Roost. She wrote of the selfie as being the perfect way for Black women to plant themselves and insert themselves, make themselves visible in a world that does not want them and does not want to see them. But she also addresses the very interesting dichotomy of Black women being hypervisible and simultaneously invisible. And she relates that to sort of famous figures such as Beyonce. Understanding self-identification in hip-hop music education as bringing the wreck, that is, a need to insert oneself into the dominant discourse, which simultaneously asserts agency of self-representation and counters the dominant gaze and its accompanying stereotypes, could offer a new perspective on how the image of hip-hop in music education is understood and indeed who forms it. Referring to intersectional music education, the German professor Ilka Siedenburg rightly points out that the images employed here, so the images that are often employed in this insertion, in this disruption of the norm as a form of self-empowerment, are visually sometimes identical to those seen in cases of objectification of the female Black body. Understanding this method of making a spectacle and disturbing the norms of hip-hop imagery, however, as an attempt to insert oneself into the dominant epistemology of hip-hop that until now has failed to create a nuanced space in which to exist, could contribute to an intersectional music pedagogy, especially one that is willing to reflect, examine, and unlearn the given norms within the field. So now we're on to kinetic orality. The term kinetic orality was first used by Cornel West to describe how in Black popular culture this interplay between rhythm and language provided a way for the marginalised to speak. So that's a quote directly from his text. And he looked at jazz music at the time and he described this method of storytelling with words and movement as, and I quote, the concrete everyday response to institutionalised terrorism. And terrorism here is referring to racism, discrimination, and the persecution of Black people in the United States. And Cornel West typically uses very extreme language to get his very important points across. Similarly, in the games Black Girls Play, Kira Gaunt explicates children's chants and games as being further forms of storytelling that create spaces for marginalised that create spaces for marginalised childhood histories to be produced and therefore contribute to a counter-narrative of history. So kinetic orality here is understood as the social tools with which Black girls form and express their musical and social identities, which creates a background of relatedness where performances of race, ethnicity, and gender are embodied through song, chant, and percussive movement. So that's the point that Kira Gaunt is making here, this idea of this background of relatedness, this creation of the stories, this creation of the history. The use of movement in music education is nothing new, but the potential of Gaunt's application and theorization of kinetic orality is that it is a Black girl authored form of storytelling, which is a distinct departure from established Black feminist thought and epistemologies which focus on the female adult perspective. So as I said at the beginning, hip-hop feminism was created as a space that was a more of a practice-based form of hip-hop more practice-based form of feminism that dealt with sort of lived experiences of women who, for example, happened to also like hip-hop. And in a way, this sort of liking hip-hop and wanting to be an empowered black woman brought with it lots of contradictions that were also sort of representative of the contradictions of a lot of black feminism at the time. It was very theoretical, and it was very important, but it was very theoretical and very academic, and wasn't very accessible for everybody on in terms of class and things like that. But also it was very much focusing on the adult perspective. So here Kira Gaunt and others also wanted to look at this idea of the black girl authored form of storytelling. And with that, my sort of idea and speculation came to this notion of adultism. So adultism is a form of discrimination that social workers and early years educators and scholars have been researching in schools and in preschool and youth work contexts in Germany and beyond, specifically at its intersection with aspects of race, gender and class, including the notion that marginalised bodies experience epistemic violence, microaggressions and structural discrimination. So this is marginalised young bodies, so we children. Some lived experience here in the background. So colonial continuities dictate what constitutes aspects of adult gender categorisation. We touched upon that a little bit when I was describing the notion of threading and stitching. Accordingly, the hip-hop feminist notion of kinetic orality, which provides a basis for black girl authorship, highlights that aspects of adultism coming from perspectives formed by dominant norms do not just dismiss or determine whose voice in the classroom is considered valued and heard, but who is even treated as a child. It is precisely this that can have an impact in the classroom, namely the question is who is seen as, namely the question of who is seen as and therefore who is treated as producers of knowledge or even innovators. If performances of race, gender and other dimensions of diversity can be situated in this dynamic form of storytelling from a marginalised perspective, I ask if taking a closer look at and further incorporating this method of storytelling with words, movement and chant and game playing could also increase the presence of intersectional, child-authored knowledge in the intersectional music classroom. So the final aspect that I wanted to talk about today is the idea of melodious misogyny. It's quite controversially named, and it's a term that's coined by Trevor B. Lindsey. So, referring to the blatant misogyny in hip-hop lyrics and videos and culture, Gwendolyn Pough exalts the importance of hip-hop feminism in tackling the issue of, and this is a quote, what it means to be a woman who participates in and loves a culture that doesn't always love you. I alluded to this quote earlier on. This is a little bit reminding us again what the sort of like reasons behind hip hop. One of the reasons behind hip hop feminism is had to sort of deal with this contradiction a little bit, and to deal with this inner and outer battle. So I want to visit the notion of melodious misogyny to consider how focusing on the sonic narrative in hip hop does not necessarily render the listeners uncritical and impervious to discriminatory or controversial lyrical and visual content. So contributing to the notion of melodious misogyny is Love's concept of sonic pleasure. So in her ethnographic study of Black middle and high school girls in Atlanta, Bettina L. Love centered on the expressivity and experience of Black girls and their relationship to hip-hop culture. A significant finding in this piece of research was that these young listeners were very much conscious and critical of the negative content, but simultaneously derived great pleasure from the sound, the melodies, and the beats of the music. Lindsey's term, melodious misogyny, expresses this difficult dichotomy whilst giving prominence to the aspect of sonic pleasure. Lindsey and Love both insist not only that we need to focus on the aspect of sonic pleasure to understand the complex relationship that Black girls have with hip-hop, but also that focusing on the sonic pleasure does not detract from efforts to combat the sexism and misogyny and homophobia and so on that we find in hip-hop culture. So while Walbaum here in Germany suggests that the enjoyment of musics indeed, can occur when an intrinsic sense of identification is experienced, including a felt connection to the musicians. So this is relating to child learners here. And this process of identification can also create an opportunity for students and child learners to interpret and conceptualize the pieces being played with their existing social context. So this idea of you form a kind of attachment to the music. You appreciate the music when you can identify with it and relate it to the existing social context. I found that quite interesting when considering this idea of melodic misogyny. So in her consideration of intersectionality in music education, Jasmine Hines in the States focuses on the importance of using what she describes as intersectional musicians. And that is how she describes it. Focuses on the importance of using these to provide a wider opportunity for self-identification for marginalised students. She highlights the need for these diverse musicians to break stereotypical portrayals of Black women and Black girls in hip-hop, yet also acknowledges that whilst essentialising can occur when hip-hop is used in music education, so this essentialising can come in the form of assumptions of which children from certain backgrounds like hip-hop and which do not, an assumption or further assumed essentialized practices such as playing Black female hip-hop artists to a group of non-white young women in an inner-city youth club, which could come from a very essentializing place in this assumption that they would like that music. However, Jasmine Hines emphasizes this very sticky reality, or this very uncomfortable reality perhaps, that these instances can sometimes actually result in positive self-identification for Black girls in music education. So it's quite a difficult thing to think about, actually, if we want to go through with our sort of developments and diversity of creating spaces where people aren't stereotyped, and at the same time these sort of assumed accidental on purpose essentializing practices can accidentally on purpose also create spaces for self-identification for people with for marginalized people. So it's a very difficult grey area, if you like, since that's a hip-hop feminist term. So melodious misogyny also adds to the dilemma of which songs are suitable for children when using hip-hop in music education. It suggests that because if we're looking at the importance of the sonic pleasure of young Black women and Black girls, this idea of then accepting that there is misogyny within these melodies, literally, and then coming to this question of, okay, well, what musics can we use which are apparently age appropriate in the classroom situation, or even in community music and other sort of extracurricular music contexts. There is this sort of suggestion that not using certain songs which would be deemed inappropriate could potentially mean preventing moments of pleasure and enjoyment for some students, and therefore moments of identification. And appreciation of the music education. But if music education is to utilise children's physical and oral enjoyment of music in direct relation to opportunities for their identification with it, and possible ability to contextualise and interpret the music, or the musical culture, as Walbaum declares, then the sonic pleasure is experienced by Black girls when listening to hip-hop, even to the songs which may reproduce essentialized and stereotypical images of women and use explicitly sexual, sexist and misogynistic language, needs to be considered in a very sensitive and open-minded way, with a lot of nuance. So that's where we are at the moment. And as Jasmine Hines says, including musicians who are intersectional and possibly imperfect could provide a larger surface for students with different differently classed, gendered and racialized ears to experience a sense of intrinsic identification and enjoy the experience. So I did leave that one till last because it's quite a tricky one to think about putting into practice at all. So, some questions as conclusions after these interesting ideas, and I left that one till the end because it's quite a difficult one to think about actually. So what does this all look like in practice? So more ideas about the practical application will follow in the workshop, but we can still ask ourselves, what is the consequence of disrupting the dominant narrative, which a lot of these aspects want to do? Retell, reshape, reconfigure, and sort of take space for things that have been eliminated in the past. So how can these disruptions or these changes be long-lasting? What can we do as educated, as sort of actors in the field? And again, how do we know which songs to choose when we're using hip hop in educational contexts, be it in schools, in youth centres, and in social work contexts as well? And what happens when we get it wrong? These questions are extremely important for any intersectional approach to music education, actually any approach to any form of music education, in my opinion. But they're actually also, especially this what if we get it wrong, is quite characteristic of hip-hop feminism in itself, because it really wants to sort of hold these contradictions and help us through the difficulties. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. I did. So just again, I'm Shanti Suki Osman, and I really enjoyed talking to you about these ideas about hip-hop feminism and intersectionality in music education. Here is my email address and a few more details about where I'm based, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.